The concept behind this series was thought of by my colleague in the Bonner Center, Becky Crawford. So I want to thank her for that. And also Bree Hayes, a senior Bonner scholar who has been just incredible at helping to support this series. Students in my first year seminar are going to be working on a report compiling what we were learning over the course of the semester as we meet with various leaders over the course of the semester in this series to provide the campus, faculty, staff, students with a really concrete document from which we can draw inspiration for developing new community-based learning classes, community-based research projects, student organizational work, but specifically in this moment when racial justice is being examined and injustice is being examined on a new scale. And I will hand off to my colleague, Professor Clovis White, to talk about the work and his partnership in the series.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and I'm happy to have this second in a series of forums. As Tanya had mentioned, my class, Race and Ethnic Relations class, is involved in a lot of focusing on racial injustice and inequality this semester as well. And we thought it would be very important for them also to experience some of the issues around that in a local community as well as nationally as well. So I'm very happy to have their participation more or less as not only concerning watching and so forth this particular event, but also having some kind of contribution, if you will, at the end of the semester in talking about the issues that were raised, as well as contribute to the report that Tanya had talked about. But without further ado, we need to move on to our presentation today. We have two distinctive individuals presenting today.
No, I know. Some of the
presenting today, and first of all, Dr. Randall Sampson. He was the founder of the LLD. Has experienced is experienced at K through 12 secondary education level as an administrator, teacher, and national transformation thought leader. Dr. Sampson's skills were honed through a Harvard University Achievement Gap Initiative and teacher quality research with Dr. Ronald Ferguson. As a result, Dr. Sampson's analysis of student performance data provided and a national value added approach to building sustainable learning environments. Our second presenter is Beth Fry. She is a public affairs professional passionate about intersection of racial politics and communities. She is a native of South Euclid, Ohio. She had witnessed massive racial turnover during her time in South Euclid, Lyndhurst City Schools, and has spent the past 5 years studying this issue. She is a co-founder of the SEL Experience Project, a blog dedicated to sharing the stories of families, teachers, and alumni of SEL schools. Fry holds a bachelor's degree or bachelor's of science in public policy analysis from Ohio State University and a master of public administration from Cornell University. Let's welcome them, and we'll start first of all with Dr. Randall Sampson, if you will.
All right. Well, hey, everybody. I appreciate being here. And so I'm going to share my screen. I think I have a quick little presentation just to make, but I appreciate being here. And my focus is going to be on culture. So I'm going to go to present. There we go. So my focus is culture and closing achievement gap, and what does that all entail? So this is something that I'm passionate about. I've been working on closing achievement gap probably for the past 15 to 18 years out of my 22-year career in education. So as an administrator, as a teacher, as a national leader in various fields, the achievement gap seems to persist, but it's getting better over time. But the culinary culprit that we're looking at is culture. So one of the things that I always talk about with equity and access is our organization's culture. It's the core as to who we are. And in that culture, we're talking about three aspects of culture: behaviors, beliefs, and values. So some of the research has shown the white flight that's occurred in inner-ring suburbs, specifically in East Cleveland, and the so-called abandonment of communities as more white folks are flighting out. But that is a unique phenomenon that's across the country as well. It's not just in East Cleveland. But it comes down to our behaviors, our beliefs, and our values. These aren't things that can be mandated by law. Our behaviors, how we treat each other, what we perceive about each other, and our beliefs. These are things that we have to take on internally. And obviously there's different ethnic groups have different beliefs in things, and whether those are reality or whether those things are perceptions, we have to unearth those and have that clear communication. And then it comes down to our value system. What do we truly value? What's at the core about what we value? And this is the United States of America. We are free to move and live where we please. But we also have a value system that we have to uphold with each other. So that all falls into this realm of culture. And as Peter Drucker says, culture will eat your strategy for breakfast. So we have multiple strategies throughout communities, throughout neighborhoods. This is not new, but the one thing that we don't address is this issue about culture. So we have to figure out what each individual culture is in each community, in each household, within each person. And that's where the rubber meets the road, because it's not one application that you can apply to every community, every block, every zip code. So we really have to take a look at that. And once again, in the United States, nothing is easy. Since the founding of this country, it has not been easy. Since the Native Americans arrived on the continent, it has not been easy. So it's what we call the grind, right? So now we take a look at our culture and how it is a direct reflection of our core values. The value that we have in a school, the value that we have in a classroom, the value that that individual teacher brings to the classroom towards their students, and the values that the students bring in. So this is a mix of things that happens, and it's not easy to mitigate, and we have to figure out a way in that process. And the first component of it is the conversation. So I have this concept that I use. It's called D squared plus P squared. So typically what we do is we'll be very descriptive in what happened. So we have this white flight. We have a situation that happened in a community or neighborhood or a state test or state performance. And then we talk about, well, why did it happen? Then we have a diagnostic. And that's where the conversation stops. We have the description about what happened. Then we try to figure out, why did it happen? Well, why are white folks leaving? Why are they leaving the community? And then it becomes almost a shameful thing as I'm not loved. They're leaving us. They're leaving us. We don't want them to leave us. We want them to come back. And then we stop there versus the predictive nature. So let's put some metrics together to where we can start to predict what will happen if we do X, Y, and Z. If we have these processes in place in our community, what will happen, so we can have those predictions. And based on that prediction method, now we can have clear prescription about how we can make it happen. What specific tools do we need? Because each community is different. Each school is different. Each school district and classroom is different. So now we can provide a specific prescription. So now it becomes a personalized approach to having a viable community, to having a great culture, rather than just one shot that does it for every community. I'll go to the next slide here. So basically what it comes down to is I have this process called the 6 pillars of growth. So the first 3 pillars of the 6 pillars focus on the growth model, right? So it's job embedded practices. So in our schools, in our community, what specific job embedded practices are we providing for learners, for teachers, for community members, stuff that that will enhance your job. So if your job is to go to school, what can we provide that will enhance your job? If your job is to work at the local community center, what can we provide to enhance your job? So it's job embedded, so now it's meaningful. It's having specific goals. We often speak about goals, but nobody ever implements them or puts them down on paper. and measures them over time. And then the hardest part about the 6 pillars is the third one, which is the self-directed growth, because we cannot mandate people to be self-directed. So we want to create a level of passion within, find out what that passion is. And from that passion, those people are typically more self-directed, including myself. And the last stage of the 6 pillars of growth is this relentless effort, having this culture of relentless effort. As we all know, effort makes the change that we need. So meaning we have to create collaborative partnerships now. And it's difficult to leave somebody and abandon them once you have collaborative partnerships, because now you know them beyond just the surface level. It's a personal relationship that you have. And then also not shying away from being data driven, making sure that we have the data. And I'm going to tell you guys real quick, just a localism. And everybody knows Big Ten football is back. So at Ohio State football, it's a data-driven organization. Every person in Ohio is data-driven. Every person knows 52 to 46 or whatever the score is, 62 to 39, that Ohio State beat Michigan. It's ingrained. It's data. Everybody knows how many yards they rushed for, how many passing yards they had. Everybody knows all of those specific details. So now we're talking about data that matters to us. So we have to figure out in cultures and in communities what data matters the most. So that way it's at the tip of everybody's tongue and we know it's specifically. And then remaining student-centered. I know the adults want to drive at this process, but we also have to make sure that this is student-centered. This is about the people that we serve, not about people serving us. So this is about the people that we serve. And the last part is the equity and application, just to show you real quick. We have remote learning happening in Lorain City schools. So one of 3 components that I said that we need to make sure that we are on point with when we talk about equity and access for kids. So one of the components that I would always talk to the school folks about is making sure that we have the devices, appropriate number of devices, meaning 1-to-1, every student has a device. It used to be where kids would share a device in one household. So if you have a family of 4, they're all sharing one laptop. Imagine trying to do homework that way or trying to learn that way in a remote setting. That's not going to happen. So making sure that we have the devices. So we purchased over 1,300 laptops in May, an additional 200 iPads, because we're talking about access. And so for the little kids, they can't type as well with the keyboards. They need touch. So we said, you have to invest in the iPads for the little kids so they can touch the screen and go. Additional laptops for staff, because we thought that, well, you're a staff member, of course you have your own device. Not necessarily. So we had to purchase 700 laptops for staff. And then the connection, and I thought this was a genius with the CEO that's there, Jeff Graham, Dr. Graham, having a connection where we have a Spectrum creating Wi-Fi in homes. It's not hotspots, because with hotspots, they go out, and now you have a whole nother tech issue. Now it takes about 4 or 5 days for kids to turn those hotspots in and for us to get them back out. And then we have cross-contamination with COVID. So Spectrum has inserted Wi-Fi inside of homes for those parents who need actual Wi-Fi. And then the best part is I pushed Dr. Graham to ask Spectrum, let's create Spectrum partnerships with high school kids. Let them become the technicians, and they can have a certificate to become a Spectrum officialized certified worker when they graduate high school and make a job at $15, $20, $30 an hour. And then the last part is produce exponential results. So the results would be 890 teacher hours of training was provided in the schedule, and school was delayed by 3 weeks to go ahead and allow for teachers to have more prep time with this technology so there can be equity and access for kids in this process. So that's the holistic view that I have when we talk about culture and the implications that culture has. So it gives us a real understanding as to what is our core values, who are we trying to serve, and what's our behaviors, and how do we act upon that based on the information that we have. And I'm going to stop sharing my presentation there. That way.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sampson. If you would, everyone, hold your questions until after both presentations are given. We'll turn to Beth Fry now. And Beth, if you would, please begin.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm really excited to be here and talking about my research that I did for my MPA thesis. at Cornell. I specifically looked into white students opting out of public schools in Cuyahoga County, which is a pretty pervasive issue facing many of the suburbs. Just a little background on myself. My bio said I grew up in South Euclid. I attended the South Euclid-Lyndhurst schools from kindergarten through 12th grade. I started kindergarten 20 years ago in 2000, and at the time the school district was about 80% white, and by the time I graduated it was almost 2/3 Black. And so there was this massive kind of racial transition in the public schools that I witnessed firsthand growing up. And that's really driven my academic and professional career in understanding how, what's the cause of these things and how does this play out. And so generally when we look at segregation, we often think of the American South because of its history with slavery, antebellum slavery, and then Jim Crow, and all of the codified segregation that existed throughout much of the 18th or 19th and 20th centuries. But the truth of the matter is that the Midwest is actually the most segregated region in the country currently. And Cleveland, the Cleveland metropolitan area, and specifically, is one of the top 5 most segregated cities in the country. And so it's really important when we have these conversations, when we move it forward, that we focus and remember that just because it was never, officially on the books that we had Black schools and white schools doesn't mean that that never existed, or that it doesn't persist today. And so that's kind of where my research jumps in. There's long been a lot of study into the effects of this decoupling factor, where communities, the general community looks one way, but the public schools look a different way. So the community itself might be still predominantly white, but the public schools are either racially integrated or trending towards becoming majority Black. And that occurs in quite a few communities on the east side inner ring of Cleveland, where I grew up. And so a lot of my research really focuses on that hyper-local, and like, what does it look like in Cleveland? What does school segregation look like in Cleveland? And particularly, what is the effect of white families opting out of public schools? And how does that kind of continue and create unequal learning across, the county? So I'm gonna pull up, I have a couple slides to share. Okay. So this is a kind of just pull out table of the white opt-out rate in Cuyahoga County between 2009 and 2018. So the white opt-out rate is the measurement of non-Hispanic white school-aged the population, or this white student enrollment divided by the non-Hispanic white school-age population. You subtract that from 1. And so as you can see, the city of Cleveland has about 2/3 of the white population living within its district opting out of public schools, whereas the median value for most districts across the county is only about 1/3. It's 35%. So there's a lot more students opting out in the city of Cleveland and the east side inner ring suburbs. So your Cleveland Heightses, your Shakers, your Euclids, your East Clevelands, compared to the west side in general. The west side, there's little to no variation between the number of white students opting out of the public schools compared to the east side, where there's kind of a huge margin there's kind of a 30-point swing between the outer ring suburbs and the inner ring suburbs. And so what we see is, there's this concentration in the area where if you live in a certain part of town and you are white, there's a good chance that you aren't going to public school. And a lot of this is driven, or it's almost exclusively driven, by the percentage of a school district's Black or enrollment of Black children. And so, for example, like the east side inner ring of Cleveland has over 2/3 of the, on average, over 2/3 or 3/4 of the students enrolled in a district are Black, compared to less than 5% on the west side and 2/3 in the city of Cleveland. And it's really important to note that, because the median value, the median Black enrollment, Black student enrollment for a school district in the Cuyahoga County is under 10%, but you have certain areas of the county where it's well over, 2/3, 3/4. And so there's this huge swing in where, and not only where Black families are living, but also where the white families are not sending their kids to public schools. And so here's just a graph of what that kind of looks like. It's a very strong linear relationship between, you can see that when you have a very low % Black enrollment, the opt-out rate is typically under 50%. And as it gets higher and higher, it goes up. So it's this very strong linear enrollment. I will point out that there's one district in Cuyahoga County that has a positive white opt-out rate, meaning that there's more students that attend the school district than live in the community, and that's because it's an open enrollment school district. It's a small open enrollment school district. And so it's kind of the anomaly of the group set. But overall, you have this very strong relationship between white families opting out of public schools when there is a high percentage of Black students enrolled in that district. And like I said, there's wide variability throughout the county. So the East Cleveland City Schools, which has a very high level had a very high level of white flight back in the 70s and 80s, has a 91.5% opt-out rate for white students. And again, there's not very white students to begin with. There's only about 35 school-aged white children that live in East Cleveland in any given school year. And Cuyahoga Heights has the lowest, so it has an almost -8% opt-out rate, meaning more children are opting in than opting out. And again, that's important to note because the median value for white opt-out in Cuyahoga County is 35%. So we understand that to be that about 35% of the general population wouldn't attend public school no matter where they lived, which happens. There's a large Orthodox Jewish population that lives in the east side of Cuyahoga County. It's a very large Catholic population that is very pro-Catholic school here in Cleveland. And so you have about 1/3 of the population that would just never go to public school. But when you get to the east side inner ring and you look at these school districts like Cleveland Heights and Euclid and Maple Heights, you have almost 2 to 2.5 times larger opt-out rates than you have in other parts of the county. And so it's very clear that it's a racially motivated decision in many cases for these families to not send their kids to public schools. And so these are the maps kind of just to geographically show what that looks like. Again, here are your inner ring. When we say inner ring, we mean, the suburbs that abut the city of Cleveland. And so you see on the east side that there's very large amounts of white opt-out. And then the further you get outside of the city, the lower it gets. School District 20 is notably, School District Mark 20 is the Shaker Heights City Schools. They've notably had a much more proactive approach when it comes to racial integration and maintaining a balance within their school over the past 50 years. And so they're kind of one of the few districts that has not fallen prey to the rapid transformation that occurs where in about a period of about 20 years, you go from being 80% white to 80% Black. So Shaker is kind of like the one anomaly in that respect. And then when you get into the map of Cuyahoga County when it comes to the percentage of Black students enrolled in a school district, again, we see it's very high on the east side, on the inner ring east side, and then almost non-existent when you look at the outer ring suburbs, again, showing that there's a concentration of Black students that live in these communities as opposed to kind of an equal distribution across the county. And so that's all I have with my slides, but I think the important thing to note is, the Midwest has the highest levels of between district segregation and metropolitan segregation of any region in the country. We outrank the South, we outrank the Northeast. And a lot of that has to do with our government structure and how we operate school districts. The Midwest is a very local control area where we're into home rule and small communities that are run by a small town council, and kind of you get to pick your little suburb or your little town, which creates problems because the greater number of suburbs and communities that you have within a given area and the more school districts you have, the easier it is for people to kind of shop around and find the community that they prefer. And so, for example, Cuyahoga County has, I think, 59 municipalities and 31 school districts, meaning that if you don't like one school district, there are 30 others that you can check out within the county. And if none of those suit you, you can also go into the outerlying counties as well. And so that's a huge reason as to why we see such large swings between districts, where you'll have a district that is 75% Black with a 55% poverty rate, and you go you move 3 streets over and you'll have a school district that is 40% Black and has a 20% poverty rate, is because people can kind of shop around and kind of pick the community that they want. And again, another thing that can happen is you have families that, if they don't necessarily like their public school district, they can choose a private school district as well, or a private school as well. I think there's about 100 between K through 12. There's like 160 private schools in Cuyahoga County alone. And so if you don't like one, I'm sure you'll find one that fits your budget or fits your mentality. And so part of kind of analyzing or thinking about how do we make these changes is, one is having conversations with people about, what does going to a quality school mean and what does it look like? Because the greatest predictor oftentimes of academic achievement and success is parental income and parental socioeconomic level and parental education. And so if you come from a family that already has resources to give you a better quality of education, why you feel the need to compound it by sending them to an affluent public school or a private school. And another thing is addressing how our policy and how our government setups can also affect the issues, because when you remove artificial barriers, when you get rid of all of those 31 school districts and you condense them down into one, you're removing options. You're kind of removing people the ability to shop around and say, well, I don't like school district A, but school district B is good. And instead it kind of forces everybody into one boat to make their, you have to either move outside of the county and live further away from the urban core, or you have to invest in private school if you don't like kind of how the school district's going. And that's one of the reasons that the South actually has the most integrated schools at the current time. So there's a lot that goes into it. And it's a very complex subject, but I thank you guys for giving me some time to talk about my research. And I look forward to some of your questions.
Okay, thank you, Beth. We do have some time to answer any questions that people might have about for both of our presenters today. Are there any questions out there? You sure? I'm sure there's questions out there.
I have a question.
Sure.
I was wondering, Beth, if you could just repeat what you said about Shaker Heights and how it relates to the research that you've done. I think I missed that point because of my connection, and that's interesting. So I wanted to clarify that.
Yeah. So Shaker Heights is an older entering suburb community on the east side of Cleveland. It's got a national reputation for its approach to integration or perhaps not integrate, but desegregation, in the fact that in the 60s, particularly in the 60s and 70s, you had a concerted effort to have investment from the community to keep, to make sure that the white families that lived in Shaker Heights still sent their kids to the public schools, despite the fact that there was increasing Black enrollment into the schools. Part of my analysis, which I didn't include in the slides, but part of my analysis is I ran a couple of regressions and found that for every 2 Black students that enter into a school district, 1 white student will exit. And so the thing with Shaker Heights is that Shaker Heights has been proactive over the past 50 to 60 years in ensuring that their district remains relatively comparable in racial makeup to the community which they serve. It's a fairly affluent community, but there are some pockets of there are some middle class pockets within it, and making sure that that there's kind of equity across the board in terms of, or there's an equal distribution that reflects the community. There's a piece in the Washington Post, if you're interested, by Laura Meckler, who's a native of Shaker Heights, that goes into a deeper dive into the successes and the shortcomings of their integration plan. If you're interested, I highly recommend it, but that's kind of the overview.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was helpful.
Are there any other questions or comments from our audience? Well, I'll take this opportunity to ask one. Dr. Sampson, I'm very interested in your idea that values are critical to the whole process of education, and that you have done some stuff in the Lorraine schools to try to at least increase the accessibility to education via the laptops and other things. Have you had, do you have any positive signs that these are things are moving along or are happening, that those values and so forth are being addressed more appropriately in terms of getting education and reducing the difference?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the modern age of the pandemic, where we have more people have accessible devices, or we're providing more accessibility through the devices, what it's really doing is creating a personalized learning experience for every kid. So now every kid has that device, and every keystroke that kid inputs can be measured systemically. Mm-hmm. And so now we have a personalized view of each kid's performance, and we have the ability as a teacher, as a school district, to analyze each kid specifically rather than in groups of kids. And then if one kid is not meeting the standard, or a couple kids aren't meeting the standard, we don't have the overall view of, oh, these kids can't because of poverty. Oh, these kids can't because of income equality, or oh, these kids can't because of access issues. Now it's this specific kid needs. And the needs change daily and hourly, depending on the topic and the subject. So just because you're gifted in math does not necessarily mean that you understood or performed really well on that quadratic equation. And so now we have a better view of that kid. Now the equity comes into play. Just because you have an IEP, or we have, just like any other school district out there, you have overrepresentation of minority boys in special ed. Mm-hmm. So now we can see their exact performance. If we think it's a misrepresentation, we have very specific work that we can analyze and look at to make sure that the kids are measuring up to not just the achievement standard. We're talking about growth over time. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants to look at achievement and say every kid has to be at a 435 RIT score. But if a kid comes in at a 235 RIT score and we can grow them to a 335, that's 100-point growth. So mm-hmm. over time, if we're patient, the kid will catch up to that achievement score. So it's about growth over time, and it allows teachers to really delve into each learner now, rather than just looking at a zip code and making assumptions that this is the kind of kid that's showing up.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. Are there any other questions out there? I have a question for Beth. You have you worked with the South Euclid or the Euclid School District in terms of trying to change the agendas of, that is making it possible for whites to come back in any way or shape or form? I mean, what kind of solutions have been organized around and knowing that people are leaving?
So I personally haven't been able to do a whole lot just because I've been kind of remote for most of my time. I was in Columbus for undergraduate, and then I was in upstate New York for my graduate degree. But one of my partners that I work with on the blog for SEL has, kind of made suggestions, I know, and tried to like talk to administrators. It depends on the community and how receptive the community and how receptive the administration is to the ideas of, what, are our schools properly representing our community and serving every student. And so in some of the like Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights specifically are much more proactive in their push for kind of retaining white students into the district, whereas the South Euclid and her schools, I don't necessarily believe that's as much high above a priority as it is just educating the children that are in front of them, which is definitely a necessary thing that needs to be done. And so I'd like to see going forward perhaps more strategies, but I currently can't speak to a whole lot on that subject.
You say the attitudes, is it related to financial at all in terms of, money's coming into the school districts? You say, for example, Shaker Heights is, as you said, a wealthy kind of area in terms of the individuals, as is Cleveland Heights. But is South Euclid so well endowed, or? I
think for parts of it, the South Euclid Lyndhurst School District is much more middle class. And particularly as white, so you have the families that are relocating, the people that are moving into the community don't necessarily have the same financial resources as the people that are moving out. But a lot of it also has to do with the culture of the community. And I think, just from my personal observations of the region, Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights and even University Heights, they're much more, they're very educated communities, they're very progressive communities. And there's like this deeply, even if you're not from there, there's this deeply ingrained, many of the people have this deeply ingrained value for social justice and equality that doesn't necessarily exist here in South Euclid. Parts of South Euclid, perhaps. Lyndhurst is a little further east, and so it's a much wider community. And there's always been like a very heavily tradition of Catholic schooling in this region, and so a lot of that kind of pushes against it. So there's definitely like a financial component in play. I also just think because you're not dealing with I don't think the average educational attainment level of most adults in the community is as high, at least among the white adult population. And so there's less of a desire to see that, as opposed to, this is my kid, I'm trying to do what's best for my kid, no matter what the consequences are to the overall community.
Thank you.
Dr. Simpson, I think you're muted.
I have a quick question for Beth, and I don't know if I should ask questions, but
oh yeah, go ahead.
Knock yourself out.
Yeah. So I heard you say earlier that the disparity between the Midwest and the South, as far as segregated schools and communities are concerned, right? And I know down South they have more of a county school system versus a local school system. So if we collapsed all of Cuyahoga County into one giant school system, which are all of the smaller school districts. How would that compare to counties in the South? So for instance, Knox County in Tennessee, they have a county system, and then Memphis just went to a county system about 4 or 5 years ago. So how does that compare when you move it apples to apples like that?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. I touch a lot on that in my thesis. I think county systems overall are much more beneficial than local systems because you can aggregate resources a lot better, and it gives you much more ability to kind of implement bolder like equity programs. The issue is, I do know with Memphis went to a county school district, and then they had a bunch of school districts break off into their little. They were like, we didn't want to be. We don't want to be with the city of Memphis, so they created. So they kind of went one way and then reversed it. But I do know there are the benefits of being in a countywide school district are A, you can aggregate resources, but B, one of the reasons that integration and desegregation plans in the Midwest and the Northeast haven't worked out as well as they have in the South was because of the numerous school districts that exist, because the Supreme Court decision Milliken v. Bradley says you can't bus across school district lines, that it's unconstitutional for some reason. Most scholars say that was a terrible ruling, but it is what it is. But there are a lot of benefits. One of the most kind of cited benefits is Louisville, Kentucky, where they merged into a singular district in the 70s and have since had a singular district for the past 45, 50 years. Their desegregation order from the courts ended in 2000, and they still managed to have a very highly integrated school system. Part of that is because they do a ranked preferencing when they do school choice. So instead of being bused to like your local community school, which oftentimes are broken up along racial or class lines, you rank which schools you want to go to, and then there's a formula that goes in that includes socioeconomic status, which they found in, at least in some of the urban areas, is a better proxy for race. That's also doesn't get them in trouble with the courts. And so that's kind of how they do it. And it's been pretty successful. But again, I think moving to a countywide system would be beneficial, at least in Cuyahoga County. Do I think it's plausible given the political climate? No. But if I'm allowed to dream, I would definitely go to a countywide system.
Yeah, when you have a culture of people wanting to live in their own little private bubbles, everybody wants their little green acres and American pie and all the other stuff, the cliches that we have. It's the culture of breaking up that American dream, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Because I want my own local representative person that I can go complain to if something goes wrong, versus I have this conglomerate county and bureaucracy that I can't ever get my complaint to about my grass is not getting blown fast enough.
Yeah, and well, there's a lot of it, is particularly if you look into urban planning research, that the smaller a municipality or a political entity is, the easier it is to restrict kind of who comes in and who comes out. And so it makes segregation a lot easier. Like I said, here in Cuyahoga County, we have 59 municipalities. We have an overlap of services. There are a bunch of the communities are going bankrupt because they can't afford to do it, but no one wants to merge because this is my community and I like who lives here and I like being able to control who lives here. And so, the idea that you can have that, people view it sometimes as a market. I'm like, oh, there's so many, you can just move where you want to, but you can only move where you want to if you have access to adequate resources to move where you want to. And if you don't have it, you're just kind of stuck.
And that's where the culture of values come in play, right? So what do we truly value here? Do we value empowering everybody and raising everybody's boats? Or do we value me having control of the power and having access, me being the only person to have access to when I have a complaint, I have enough power to where I can move the chips to where I need to move them?
Yeah, or even at least in a lot of the research that I found, particularly when you're dealing with middle to affluent white parents who are kind of particularly knowledgeable of just how kind of cutthroat college admissions can be and the internship application processes and all of that. They're kind of desperate to keep their kids in like the same standard of living as they are. And so even if they are, you know, progressive in their politics, they'll often make decisions that are opposite of their ideals and in effect to withhold or maintain their status, which is particularly noticeable in they've done studies in like New York City and other progressive areas where it's, you know, yes, I want there to be equity and justice and, you know, a fair shot for everybody, but my like first immediate goal is to make sure that like my kid can get into Stanford or whatever, despite the fact that there's pretty robust research that says that racially segregated schools don't really benefit anybody, no matter what people say on their quality. So it's kind of a vicious cycle that it just needs to be broken, but no one's kind of brave enough to break it.
All right. So I want access for mine, but I'll give you equity for yours. You know, and then that's how folks look at it sometimes, right?
Yeah.
I want 100% access to all of the Ivy Leagues and all of the best services for my kids. But if your kid's not making it, we'll give you equity, but the access is not part of the bargain here, because the minute your kid gets access, that pushes my kid out the door.
Mm-hmm.
It's a zero-sum game is the way that people look at it, but it really shouldn't be. It's really all boats rising when everybody has the access, and then we provide them the very specific tools to rise. Everybody doesn't get the same tools. You get the very specific tools to get you to your next destination, but everybody's enjoying the same ride to the top.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that just comes into when you're talking to, at least in my, got the hiccups, in my experience when talking to other white families about this, is always framing it as, you know, as I said earlier, the greatest predictor of educational attainment or educational achievement, and we've known this for 60 years, is parental education level and family socioeconomic status. And so, like, I come from an upper middle class educated family, and my parents sent me to my school district despite being told by multiple people that they were making a terrible decision, because they knew that we didn't need as many resources as a lot of other children needed, because whatever the school couldn't provide, they could provide for us. And so not only did we go to those schools and, you know, help with create a community of diversity, but my parents were both super involved in the schools and were able to advocate not only for us, but the other children as well. And so it's important to frame those conversations in, we did this, and like, it didn't screw us over for life. I mean, I think I've done fairly well for myself. My brother was salutatorian and went to Northwestern, so it didn't hinder us. And I think that's a lot of the conversation when we talk about this needs to come down to individual conversations among families, and framing it in a way as it's not the boogeyman you're making it out to be.
Well, thank you, both of you. Time has run out. Tanya, you want to take over?
I know that our time is just about over, but I also just wanted to suggest the importance of not attributing value to integration because of what white students might bring to a district, or white families living in a particular district might bring, that there is a much deeper reason that these inequities exist. And I recognize that we are all probably in agreement about that, but I think sometimes these arguments can get consolidated and even co-opted by for ill purposes based on those value judgments.
Definitely.
Thank you both so much for being here and for this incredibly stimulating conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks everybody for being here.